Sam Raju, welcome again.
Thanks, Hannes. It's great to be back again with you.
Right. Few words for introduction for the people who hasn't watched our previous show. You come from where exactly and what is apologetics?
I come from the south of India, the state of Kerala. I moved to the US in 2012. I've made my home in the US for the last almost 12 years, except for a few years that I was away from the US. And apologetics simply is giving a defense, and Christian apologetics is giving an intellectual defense for the Christian faith.
So we're going to defend Christians and God today in this show.
We're going to give a defense for the Christian faith. Why is it that we believe what we believe?
Right. Well, we do have tough questions. We all know that, us Christians and people who are not Christians, they quite often, we even have the same question, for example, about evil, the cancer, suffering, and all that. And on our last show, we talked about the evil in the world, and you addressed that the evil has been brought on by the humans, by our evil deeds. But then we have this term, acts of God. We don't really have it in Estonian, but I know in English we have it, meaning that, natural disasters. I used to live in Oklahoma, state of Oklahoma, and there is lots of tornadoes, and you see the devastating results, and you see how some people die sometimes because of that. And we have the floods, we have all kind of crazy stuff, and thousands of people die. So how come good God has such a strange acts of God where people die?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in the previous episode when we talked about evil, I addressed this question of moral evil. And we talked about this assumption that many of us have that an all-powerful God can do anything. There is also this assumption that a perfectly good God will prefer a world in which there is no evil over a world in which there is evil. But that is not necessarily the case. For instance, as a parent, and for those parents who are watching as well, you would know what I'm talking about. We take our kids to the doctor when they are young to be vaccinated. Now imagine being that little boy or little girl being taken by his or her parents to the doctor, and the doctor gives the vaccine. And then at the end of it, as the kid is watching, the parent pays the doctor for administering pain. Now, think about what is going through
I never thought about that.
Think about what is going through the child's mind, I
Right.
thought my parents loved me dearly, but now I see them taking me to the hospital so that the doctor will administer pain and then reward the doctor for doing that. For the parent knows that unless he allows this pain in the present, there could be a greater pain that could come and inflict the child and create havoc and much more damage in the life of the child. So to prevent a greater pain, he allows a minor pain in the present. Likewise, God may have, and I believe God has morally justifiable reasons in allowing certain amounts and pains and suffering in the present. So there's a theory in science called chaos theory. And I'm not making this up. Anybody can Google it. But it sounds pretty strange. It's also called the butterfly effect. It goes like this. A butterfly fluttering its wings in West Africa can start to set in motion events that could ultimately result in a tornado in North America. So someone, an observer, watching the butterfly fluttering its wings in West Africa, he cannot predict what will come out of this particular instance of the butterfly fluttering its wings. Likewise, when we look at the present, we look at some evil in the world and we wonder, what good can come out of it? What good God would allow something like this? There is no good reason that I can see that God could allow something like this. Well, we have to understand we are finite temporal beings and God is an infinite eternal being. And he has the vantage point, what we call epistemic vantage point of looking ahead into the future and see what good can come out of this present pain. So in his wisdom, to bring about a greater good, he may allow certain amounts of pain and suffering in the present. So that would be my brief take on this particular issue of why God would allow certain amount of pain and suffering in the world today. There's a second response. It comes from the land of my own birth, India. There was this missionary called Paul Brand, a doctor. He went to India and he was serving in the leprosy community in India. This was several decades ago. And he wrote a book called The Gift of Pain. And he narrates his experience in India. When he worked among leprosy patients, he noticed a number of these leprosy patients, they didn't have their extremities. It was like eaten off or bit off. And he found out that these patients, they are kicked out of their homes, they're isolated, they're living in poor surroundings. So in the night, rats would come and gnaw on their fingers, and because they couldn't feel any pain, they wouldn't know. It's only the next morning they realize that part of their finger is not there.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah. So I can't imagine living in such a situation. So Brand devised a plan. He created pressure-sensitive gloves, and he also knew that there is this area in the back of the elbow where these patients can experience pain. So he connected a wire, so to speak, and then every time the rat gnaws, it will send an electric shock and immediately alert the leprosy patient that there is imminent danger, there is rat gnawing on his fingers. And that would alert him, and then he would wake up and then, get rid of the rat or do whatever is necessary to prevent that from happening. So pain at times is a blessing. That is the point of the book, The Gift of Pain. So if our world was perfect, if there was no pain, there was no suffering, we can live with this false sense of security that all is well. But in reality, as Christians, we know that we are separated from God. As human beings, we have rebelled and sinned against God, and we are alienated from Him. And so pain awakens us to that deeper reality. And then, gives us the realization that we need to come back to God. We are not made for this world, we are made for another world. So there is a blessing in pain, and there are some goods that God can bring about by allowing certain amount of pain and suffering in the world. I know this is a big issue, and for a short interview, I can't fit in a big, a response that would satisfy everyone in this particular regard.
Yeah, it is somewhat tough to expect or agree with or get satisfied or get your peace with this answer. That we need pain or that it does exist, because some people quite often they look at the children, and you mentioned about in the previous show you talked about your story with the cancer, like little kids, 7 months old, 2.5 years old, they die in cancer, and you think, man, God is so unjust. This is so innocent little child. How come?
Yeah, it is a challenging question. This problem is probably the biggest obstacle for many coming to the faith. But I think it was Bertrand Russell who said, what would the Christian tell a child who is dying in a hospital? I think the more accurate way to put it is like, how can anyone believe in God sitting beside a child that is dying in the hospital? William Lane Craig talks about an experience that he had when he was in Paris. He met with a young American missionary doctor who was also trained in seminary, I think, and he was into counseling children. He said, this American doctor said, I would ask Bertrand Russell, what would you say? What does atheism have to offer a child? Too bad? Bad luck? There is no immortality. Christianity, there is the promise of a life after death, a life of joy and perfect peace and enjoyment with God. I mentioned my struggle with cancer in the last episode, and I think you alluded to it a little bit here as well. So in 2014, when I was wrestling and asking all sorts of questions, I remember God ministering to me in my moments of intense pain and grief. And I was alerted and awakened to the reality of the promise that Christ offers of eternal life. And there was a song that I would sing time and time again, and that brought so much peace and joy to my heart as well. It goes like this: what a day that will be, when my Jesus I shall see, when I look upon his face, the one who saved me by his grace. What a day that will be. There'll be no more tears, there'll be no more pain, there'll be no more grief, my body will be whole. What a day that will be. So there is this hope that we have as Christians, that we are longing and eagerly looking forward to the day when Christ will return and he will right every wrong and he will establish his kingdom fully on this earth.
This is a really good hope we have, and the really good explanation. I never thought of asking atheists, what will you offer? What will be your response to this little kid? Too bad, you're just going to die. But then again, you mentioned that, you have this hope as a Christian, looking forward, meeting Jesus, stepping to another reality, paradise, heaven, however we call it. But then there is a hell, and people say, if God is good, how come he sends people to hell?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. But when we say God is love, we also affirm that God is just. God is love, God is just. Let me phrase it this way. Imagine a heaven in which you have Mother Teresa, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. Irrespective of how you live on earth, all of us are met with the same fate, heaven for all. Would that be just?
No, not in my eyes,
It won't be just. So precisely for that reason, people who live lives that are so contrary to the commands in Scripture, who hurt and abuse people, it is imperative that they'd be judged for their deeds. And so hell is where people are freely choosing to reject God and do that which is evil, and then ultimately they are judged for how they live their life on earth.
Yeah, there is some saying, I can't, I don't want to charge people, but some people say, well, if hell is where my friends are, they're where I want to go, drink beer and whatever.
Yeah, I think there's this false notion of hell as some sort of like a party place, but I think that's far from reality. A life apart from God is the greatest tragedy.
We're talking about justice. God is justice, God is love. The church is representing God in the earth, and yet there is so much corruption and so much wrong in the church. Medieval times, killing people, the witch hunt in Europe, in United States, sexual scandals up to this day, financial scandals. So that turns people away from God.
Absolutely. Several years ago, I was in a conversation with an atheist professor, and I was laying out arguments for God's existence. She stopped me right in the middle, and she said, Sam, do Christians truly believe in what they proclaim? And I was wondering, where is she going with this? I obviously believe, and I assume all Christians do believe. Then why is, what's the point of this question? She said, if Christians truly believed that there is an all-seeing, perfectly righteous, good God, why is it that they live such duplicitous lives? So that is a question that I have wrestled with. I think the sad reality is when the church abuses power and goes against the teachings of Jesus Christ, that brings dishonor to the name of Christ. And that is the greatest tragedy of our times. And it's so unfortunate that people who claim to be followers of Christ do that. And I think we as Christians must call out the church when the church does it and speak truth to power. And we have to differentiate between the history of the church and the person of Jesus Christ, unfortunately, at times. But having said that, I would also say that there are great churches and great Christians who proclaim the truth of the gospel, and we have to fellowship with them and commune with them for our own health and benefit.
We're talking about Christian church, Jesus Christ. You know, Estonia is in Western Christian world, but there are so many other religions. You come from the land of Hinduism. We have Muslim, we have Buddha, and all sorts of other religions. Why Christ? Why not Islam? Why not Hinduism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I remember speaking at a university several years ago, and I was addressing the topic as Science Buried God. At the end of my talk, someone walked up to me and said, I agree with your conclusions tonight, that science has not disproved God. But why should I follow Jesus? I presume that you are a Christian. Why should I follow Jesus? Now, this is a question that many people ask. I would say, first of all, when you look at all the religions of the world, except for Christianity, the teachings are central, like Islam. God could have used another medium to communicate the teachings of Islam other than Muhammad. Buddhism. Buddha is not the central figure, although Buddhism comes from Gautama Buddha. The teachings of Buddha is central. It is not the person. But in Christianity, the person of Christ is central. The teachings are secondary. So when you look at the person of Jesus Christ, it's quite fascinating. For a moment, if I were to look at the person of Christ through the eyes of his followers, just for one example would be John, the disciple. He said, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. What he's saying is, this man of history, Jesus, predates creation. He is God incarnate. He is not man indwelt by God. He is the God-man. And so some people say, well, that is what Jesus' followers made him to be. But that's not the case. Jesus never claimed to be God. But that's quite interesting too, because Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He claims to be the exclusive way. So if we take Jesus at his word, if Jesus is true, all else is false. All other religions are not true. This third thing is when Jesus says, I forgive you. Let's say I stepped on your foot and I say, I'm so sorry.
I'll say, I forgive you. No problem, man.
It's your prerogative to forgive me. Nobody else can speak on your behalf and say, you are forgiven. Because I didn't wrong them, I wronged you. Jesus says, I forgive you. Who else could he be but claiming to be God? And that is how his audience understood him. So that's why they wanted to do away with him. So Jesus claimed to be God. And the third thing is, anybody can claim to be God. But if a dead man comes back to life, I would believe him. And he did. And so if you look at history, if you look at, there are a number of writers like N.T. Wright and Gary Habermas and Mike Licona who have addressed the historicity of the resurrection. It's quite fascinating that there is so much evidence for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. Because think of the disciples of Jesus. Where did they preach the good news of Christ's resurrection? About 50 days, almost 50 days after the event had transpired where Jesus was crucified, they were in the heart of Jerusalem proclaiming that this Jesus you put to death has risen from the dead. All that the Jewish leaders and the other people needed to do was to take them to the grave and show them the body. Christianity would have died. It would have been the end of the Christian faith. But there was no body. The tomb was empty. The second thing is, Jesus' first eyewitnesses were women disciples. If this was an invention, the gospel writers would have had men discover the tomb because women's testimony in those days were not regarded as trustworthy. So if it was a legend, they would have had men discover the tomb and not women. So there is a lot of evidence for the historicity of the resurrection, and there are extra biblical sources that talk about disciples going around proclaiming that this man had risen from the dead and they suffered and died for it. So you wouldn't tell a lie for if you have to pay with if you have to pay with your life for it. The disciples, that's what they lost. They lost everything for proclaiming the good news of the gospel.
Yeah, people would say, prove it scientifically. That's just a fairy tale. That's just a myth that he rose. There is no. Is there something that science cannot prove, and we can still believe in that?
Absolutely. Like when you think of the works of Aristotle, there's this man called Aristotle.
Yeah, everybody knows him.
How do we prove scientifically that there was this man Aristotle?
No, I just believe in.
It's history,
I believe what I've heard.
Yeah, but it's part of history. History happens once. You can't scientifically do an experiment and bring that back. People talk about time travel these days. That's a different thing. So anyways, but having said that, there is this idea in the world today that science is the only means of gaining knowledge. But that is problematic. It is self-defeating because it's not a statement of science, it is a statement about science. It is self-defeating. It's like if I say, there are no sentences in the English language that are longer than 3 words. That's self-refuting because that sentence itself is longer than 3 words. If I say I do not exist, then who is speaking, right? So when people say science is the only means of gaining knowledge, that is self-refuting because that's a statement about science, not a statement of science. The second thing is science has limitations. For instance, mathematical and logical truths. We presume that in order to do science. Science doesn't give us that. Ethical facts like to torture an innocent child is morally wrong. Science doesn't tell us that. When you do a study when you do an experiment in a lab, you should report truthfully. Science doesn't tell us that. That is ethical judgments. It's a field of ethics. Then aesthetic judgments, the beautiful like the good cannot be scientifically proven. Then you have the principle of causality, that whenever you see an effect, there is a cause. Science doesn't tell us that. We assume that principle of causality to do science. There is an external world out there which was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of time. That's a metaphysical truth. Science doesn't tell us that. That is not the case, that the world existed for longer than 5 minutes. So you assume certain things in order to do science. So the whole notion that science is not based on assumptions is not true. There are some fundamental assumptions that we hold to in order to meaningfully do science.
There is another question. We have 4 minutes left for the show. What is conscience? Where does that come from? How does it work with the science?
Oh, that's a challenge for many scientists today. How do we explain the moral sense deep within us that when we see people abusing children, when we see innocent people being bombed and killed, there is this anger and rage within us. We know that intrinsically this is not right, this is wrong. And it's also with us, like, when we do something wrong, we know deep within we did something wrong. So there's this moral compass within us. And I would argue that naturalistic atheism cannot explain that. God has written his laws deep within our heart. And he has created us in his own image. And that, I think, best explains the moral compass within us. And I think the conscience is that moral compass within each human being.
What would be the toughest question ever asked from you?
I think there are 2 questions that are very challenging for as Christian philosophers are wrestling with. The first is a problem of evil that we touched upon. There are lots of volumes and material on that. The second is a problem of what we call divine hiddenness. If God exists, and if he desires to have a relationship with us, why doesn't he make himself more obvious?
Exactly.
I think there are two responses that I could possibly give in the next minute or so that I have. The first one is, I want to make a distinction between belief that and belief in. God's goal is not to get us to believe that he exists. If his goal was just to get us to believe that he exists, then he just probably could give us some spectacular signs of the evidence for his existence. But his desire is to have us to believe in him. Now, obviously, then the question is, what is the difference between belief that and belief in? Let me illustrate that quickly. You know, I boarded my flight from Washington, D.C. A few weeks back. When my family and we boarded the plane, we believed that this plane will take us to our destination, Berlin. If we didn't believe that, we wouldn't board the plane. But then, having believed that, we entered the plane and took the seats that were assigned to us. Now we have acted on the belief that this plane will take us to a destination. It is an act of faith. It is trust. So, like when I sat on this chair, I believe that this chair can hold my weight.
And it has.
And it has. And I sat on it. So now I've believed in the chair. So God's goal is to get us to believe in him. And so not just believe that. The second thing is, in Romans, Paul says, man's problem is not the absence of evidence, it is the suppression of evidence. I believe God has given us enough evidence of his existence in the world, but we do not want to believe in God, and we suppress the evidence, and that is the charge that Paul makes in Romans chapter 1.
Sam Raju, thank you so much for coming here to Estonia, for explaining and helping us to understand our Creator more, and giving us some answers to the people, you know, to the secular people around us.
Thanks so much, Hannes, for your kindness, and I really enjoyed being on the show with you today.
Thank you. Ja teile ka, head televaatajad, aitäh, et olite meiega, et kuulasite, mõtlesite kaasa. Loodetavasti saite häid vastuseid küsimustele, mis teil endal on, ja vastuseid ka nendele inimestele, kes teie käest küsivad. Saade külalised meilt ja mujalt, selleks korraks läbi 2 külalisega, 1 meilt, teine mujalt, aga saade loomulikult on eetris juba järgmine nädal või sõltub, kui te vaatate kuskilt sotsiaalmeedias, siis millal iganes te klikite sellele järgmisele lingile. Aitäh teile ja jumal õnnistagu teid!